one thing that will be important as this AI stuff is happening is to have something that is equivalent to the right telephone.
Right.
I do buy some of the crazy or scary stories about what could happen with AI, and not necessarily because God takes over, but more so just like it's happened many times in human history that some more coordinated group has managed to do some sort of coup or slowly take over control. So the kind of thing Cortez did or Pizarro did. And I think a key way that can be prevented, or you can reduce the risk of that, is different human groups should be in like tight contact with each other,
right,
and have the same kind of mechanism that vaccination creates with diseases. So the key advantage that the Spanish had over the New World empires was that the Spanish knew how each previous conquest had gone, but the Incas and the Aztecs didn't know about what strategies are used, how horses work, how steel works. So how that translates here is I think there might be some crazy things these AIs tried, especially if you have this like bifurcated world, which I think is actually very valuable from an alignment and safety perspective, because you have this independent experiment or independent lineage. If their AI tries to do something crazy, I think it's like very important that they feel that they can tell us, and we do the exact opposite. Long preamble to ask the question of how do we set up that kind of high trust or prerequisite understanding on these kinds of issues, such that this kind of...
That is a terrific question. And I think that really gets to the heart of a lot of stuff. And I don't have a great answer to that, right? Because fundamentally, what you're saying is that there needs to be, a communication system, a network of interactions between two highly competitive zones, the U.S. and China, basically, where they have to be able to operate with some degree of trust, right? And I think the problem that we face in trying to analyze this is a lot of the analogies that you might reach for, break down at some point. So you brought up the red telephone, which basically is a reference to the line of communication that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had during the Cold War, where the threat that you were trying to avert was nuclear holocaust, basically. And in some ways, I think that's an apt analogy, and we kind of need to think broadly along those terms. But the specific problem that we were dealing with there were these very self-contained systems that were clearly under highly centralized control by a couple of people. And so having that one-to-one line of communication was an effective response to that particular problem. With AI, it's much more diffuse, much more decentralized, much more unpredictable what the problems could be. And, it's kind of easy, I think, to create – easy, we say in retrospect. It was hard at the time, but it was a sort of, if you will, maybe a 2 or 3 dimensional process to come up with game theory to enable us to manage the nuclear balance of terror, right? So I don't want to minimize Thomas Schelling's achievement. It was great, but it was like a 2 or 3 dimensional problem, right? I think with AI you have more like a more than 3 dimensional problem. So it is consequently more difficult to figure out how do you create a game theory solution to this that is kind of stable, right? I think what you can say at a minimum right now is there are ways in which the U.S.-China relationship today resembles that of the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s, i.e. before the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And I don't want to exaggerate this too much, but the sort of diminution in exchange, in communication over the last 6 or 7 years is really alarming. So give a simple example on this. When Trump came into office the first time in 2017, he inherited a structure where there were approximately 100 working level dialogues between U.S. government and Chinese government officials, plus all of this investment and private sector stuff that was going on. But just at the formal level, there were over 100 dialogues. He got rid of all of them, 100%, right? And He then replaced them with one, which was the trade talks that he had in his first term. And that was the only, basically, mechanism that we had of communication. Did this create a specific problem? It did. So if you look at the early stages of COVID, right, back when SARS came out in 2003, there were staff members of the United States Centers for Disease Control embedded in the Chinese Centers for Disease Control, or their equivalent organization. And that relationship, in fact, grew significantly, in part because of SARS over subsequent years. And that was a very, very useful channel of getting information out. It was not perfect. It had, plenty of problems. But the absence of that channel, I think, was really catastrophic in the early days of COVID, where we literally had no way of understanding what was going on within the Chinese system. There was no back channel that enabled us to get even a little bit of a head start on what was going on. And I think that had very, very dire consequences. You can probably trace many, many, many deaths and a lot of social chaos to the inability of the U.S. and China to communicate at that critical moment, right? So we have essentially dismantled the whole structure of communication. The Biden administration basically took the same view. They introduced a few more things. So there were a few more communication channels that they handed off to Trump that I think have not been made use of. So we're back to essentially zero, except for the trade. And that is a very, very dangerous situation to be in with regard to global public health, any kind of sort of global coordination, whether it be on macroeconomics or climate effort or whatever, and on these issues like AI, right? I think that's a really bad place to be. So we're starting at a rather dangerous position. I think it should be a priority to figure out how we can get there. And it's very hard to see how we get there given the political environment, frankly, in both countries. So in the United States, you have this narrative that China is this bad actor. They have an illegitimate government. They are a systemic rival. We basically have to contain, constrain, control them. And any kind of interaction with them is in and of itself dangerous. So you have people in Congress saying, I don't want to go to China. There's no point in going to China. A, because I'll pay a political price for it. If I go there, I will be tarred as someone who went to China and therefore is tainted. And what can I possibly learn? I already know what I need to know, right? So you have a deliberate effort, I think, with the United States to reduce the channels of information that we have with China and direct experience, which is very bad. And, I think one of the bad outcomes of COVID in China was that they kind of locked themselves off from the rest of the world for almost 3 years. They got really obsessed by this self-sufficiency, industrial policy, complex. The Chinese system has always had a lot of difficulty communicating with the rest of the world. This has been persistent for many decades and centuries. And so this gave them a great excuse to just not do the thing that made them feel very uncomfortable, which is engage in communication with the rest of the world. And they concluded, it's kind of okay. And so they also retreated into a very sort of paranoid narrative about what the U.S. is up to, which is to a significant degree justified, but not entirely. And I think lost sight of the value of really robust communications lines with the rest of the world. So both sides are entrenched in very suspicious, self-reinforcing narratives about the other, which makes it incredibly difficult to forge a better communication system. And I have to say, I'm fairly critical both of the Biden administration and the Trump administration, different ways how they handled this. I think the Biden administration could have done a lot more, a lot faster. I think they were sort of had the idea that it was good to have more communication, but they waited for 2 years before they did anything. And then they were very parsimonious about how they did it. And I think they could have been much more aggressive. They weren't. And that is a problem. And then I think the Trump administration, unfortunately, just doesn't place strong value on having respectful communications with anyone in the world, frankly. And then when you compound this with the paranoia about China, then it just creates more. Well, I don't want to say paranoia. That's too loaded a term, but the suspicion, the fear, the distrust of China that exists. It's very hard to see how you get them. So I agree with you that we need something like that. I'm kind of pessimistic that we'll get there anytime soon, unfortunately.
The red telephone point you made is actually really interesting. It didn't occur to me before that AI is such a diffuse thing. It's like saying we're going to have a red telephone out of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, exactly. How do you do that?
Right.
You can't.
If you enjoyed this clip, you can watch the full episode here and subscribe for more clips. Thanks.